You're listening to another ambitious entrepreneur.network.com podcast, the voice for entrepreneurs and small business. Now, onto the show.
Welcome to Industry Thought Leader Podcast. Stand out, be heard, influence. Want to influence real change with your message while become known as an authority in your field? Industry Thought Leader Podcast will show you how. Now, over to your host, Anne-Marie Cross.
And welcome to another episode of Industry Thought Leader Podcast. My name's Anne-Marie Cross, known as the Podcasting Queen. And I have got two awesome guests today. They are podcast experts because they've got a top rating show. And we're going to dive in and pull apart the things that they've learned along the way, the do's and the don'ts, because I know so many of you have reached out and said, Anne-Marie, we're thinking of creating a co-hosted podcast. Can you give us all of the insights? And so I thought, who better than to invite my guests? So let me introduce them to you. So joining me on today's show is Amy, Revell and Kirsty Farrugia, and they really are industry leaders and professional organisers, and together they have co-hosted and brought to you the Art of Decluttering podcast. Now, they both have a passion to transform the world through intentional living by equipping people to clear the clutter in their heads, their hearts, and their homes. Now, on today's show, I'm going to really tap in, or we'll take you back to when they started, all of the lessons that they've learned, things that they may have done differently to really take that podcast to where it is today. So welcome, ladies.
Thanks, Anne-Marie.
Thanks for having us.
So take us back. I know, Amy, you've been on the show for a number of times, and, it's been wonderful to be able to kind of check in and see how you're going. But really take us back to when you first started. Back then, you both had separate businesses. Now you're in partnership. But what was the reason that you thought, you know what, we're going to start a co-hosted podcast?
That's all you, Kirst.
So we were trying to figure out how we could grow our businesses and grow our email lists, and just trying to figure out how we could collaborate together. And we came up with a few ideas, but nothing was really sticking. And I was really into podcasting, still am. And Amy wasn't at the time. And I had come up with the idea. I was really passionate about starting a podcast. And I was like, well, why don't we just try a decluttering podcast? And we looked in the market. There was no Australian professional organisers doing it, producing a podcast around decluttering. So we gave it a crack, and here we are 2.5 years later.
Yeah, it's amazing. And I love the way that you've said, we had an idea and we thought, why not? Let's give it a crack. I think that's kind of the Aussie way sometimes, isn't it? To say, let's just dive in and we'll figure it out on the way down and the way through, which is fabulous. So, and one of the things that people may not realise, because they assume I need to be in the same location, but Amy, you're in Melbourne, Victoria, my hometown, and Kirsty, you're in Sydney or in Queensland? Whereabouts are you based?
Sydney.
In Sydney. So that's about an hour flight. And so when you first started, obviously you had to come together. So what technology did you use initially, and how does that look now?
The first technology we used was Skype.
Yes.
And if people go back and listen to the first dozen or so episodes, they will hear that we really were trying to work out technology. The content was fantastic. The technology, not so much. And then we moved to Zoom, I think, Kirst, we started using maybe. And then eventually we decided that Kirst would fly down to record. So now, once every 8 weeks, Kirst jumps on a plane, flies down for the day. We hire a recording studio, and it all gets done locally now. But there's plenty of podcasts that have two hosts that do it remotely still.
Yeah, fabulous. So I love the way that you are now strategically programming and producing, and you're kind of doing what I love to do in all areas of business, is block out time and commitment for different projects. So what does it look like for you guys then planning? Because I'm assuming that when you fly down, Kirsty, when you're together, you try and knock out as many episodes as you can for an upcoming season. So what does that look like? Take us from the planning to kind of how many shows you typically record in a session.
Sure. Well, we crowdsource our ideas for the podcast. So we ask our community what they'd like us to talk about. And obviously, we come up with our own ideas too. And then we just go into Google Docs and nut out the bare bones of a show. So we put dot points down. We're not a scripted show. We ad lib quite a lot, but we do put the dot points down, and we also have thank yous and where we want to point people to, so that it's really easy to create the show notes from the pre-prepared work we do. And then I fly down and we get in and we record eight episodes in one session. Wow. And that leaves us room to do some ads as well, and go out for lunch every time. We go to sushi every time.
So important. That's on the agenda all the time.
Yeah, that's every time it goes on.
So, I love that. Yeah. So had you always done that then, or has that progressed because now that's the most efficient? Is that how you were producing when you first started?
No, when we were started off, we were doing one episode a week. So we'd set aside, say, an hour on a Monday. We'd get on Skype. We would record the episode, and Kirsty would do all of the editing, which was a massive job. And we did that for quite a long time until we could afford to outsource the editing. And we have a sound engineer that's on our team now. So it has evolved as the podcast itself has evolved.
Yeah, I love that. And so what was the decision then? Because obviously when you first started, you had, what people may not know, you had individual businesses. And now, of course, you have combined forces. You now are a partnership. What was the decision that kind of prompted that move? If you don't mind me asking, I'm just curious, because I mean, ultimately now there's one call to action because both of you are now working in the one business. So what prompted the collaboration?
Yeah, it is just that, having that one brand so that people weren't confused about, and because it is an audio learning tool. Yes. So people didn't know, well, which one's Kirsty and which one's Amy. Mm-hmm. They know that I'm in Melbourne, they know that I'm in Sydney and Amy's in Melbourne, but they may be in Melbourne, but they weren't. And so they knew that they were getting Amy, but which one is Amy? Yeah. So, and it was just that at the end of every podcast, we'd go, okay, if you want to learn more about Kirsty, go here. And if you want to learn more about Amy, go here. And we were just, as the podcast has grown and grown in success, we realized that we just wanted to be the one brand. We were all really well aligned in our vision and our purpose of the podcast, and we're very similar and very well aligned in our businesses as well. So it just made sense for us to just have the one brand. Makes it really clear and easy for our listeners and our audience to know where to go.
Yeah, such a great strategy, because now you can say we're across 2 locations. So,
yes.
And it is so difficult, because one of the things, of course, when you're developing and building rapport with your audience, people fall in love with the both of you, and it's like, who do I choose? Do I choose? And it's almost like you're betraying someone. Oh, well, I've decided to go with her. That kind of thing. Because let's talk about audience. One of the things that I see you doing really well, and why I'm really excited about this and being able to kind of get your feedback. As we know, when we're looking at some of the trends for 2020 around social media and around communicating, we're now seeing that even the larger platforms such as Facebook are investing heavily in the messaging platform. So, the communications are coming off some of the more, outside. So in other words, externally on the platform of Facebook, the feed, now into Messenger. But what you've done really well is created a community in your Facebook group. Did you always start with that Facebook group with the art of decluttering, or did that come later too?
Yeah, that came later when we were just talking about how to connect with our community. What we found is people were emailing us and messaging us in our separate businesses and on our podcast page and just saying, I feel like I know you girls. And there was that community, but it was us and one other person at a time. And so what we decided probably 12 months ago, Kirst, would you say, is we decided, hey, we're going to start this Facebook group and just see what happens, have it as a place where people can come together. And because decluttering is such a thing where when you're together, it makes it easier, we thought that would be helpful for our people. And it has just thrived. I think we're just hit over 4,100 So 4,100 something. And it's so active, it runs itself. People are in there asking questions and sharing photos. And it's been a really, it's like an anchor for our podcast, because that's where people know they can go.
Yeah, I love that. And are you finding now that people are coming to that group and then going, oh, then there's the podcast? So you're starting to find that people are finding the one and then the other. So initially you started it because you wanted a community to send people from the podcast to this group, but now vice versa. Are you finding that's happening as well?
Yeah, Facebook's algorithm is wonderful for that. People are finding, we must be in the suggested list, and people are coming in every day. And one of the questions that we have upon entry is, do you know about our podcast? And I would say about 50, probably higher than 50%, probably more like 70% of those people are saying no, but I'll go check it out now.
Yeah.
So it's been fantastic.
Yeah. I think what you're doing, and I love the way, before we hit record, I was saying to Amy, sometimes you make a decision in the business and you go, well, that worked really well. You launch something else, well, that didn't work so well. And that's just the whole point of business, isn't it? You try out these things, but I love the way that you've put pieces into what your marketing mix. And that's so important from any business, because, you're creating an audience on your podcast, but you're also creating an area where they can now go and not only listen to you, but also connect with other people. And I think you're tapping into an industry or a demographic and psychographic of ideal client who loves sharing, because a lot of them are mothers, aren't they? Mums, and you find more of an Australian group, or you're finding that international people are now finding and subscribing to the podcast and joining the group too?
Yeah, it's become very international. I think, Kirsten, am I right that about 50% of our listeners are from Australia? Yeah. Is it a bit more than that? And the rest,
maybe 60.
Yeah, and
between 50 and 60.
Yeah,
yeah. The US is about 25%. Yeah. And
so the Facebook group, the Facebook group has been really great, because the Americans, the Northern Hemisphere, interact overnight. So we wake up to all this interaction between people, and so it's just so encouraging.
Yeah. One thing that I'll just question, because, and by the way, I know that there are a few people that are stalking around. If you've got a question that you would like to ask either Amy or Kirsty, let me know, and I'll pop the comment up on the screen, and then one of them will answer that for you. But one of the things that you hear about a community when you're integrating that, there is this caution that if you're not there and if someone's not monitoring, that sometimes this whole conversation that's not nice, that's not supportive. What have you instigated into the community? Or maybe you're just so clear on the culture that that's the people that you attract. But are there any rules that you set off right at the beginning to say, hey, this community, this is how we're running, and we're not going to accept anything less? Is there anything like that in place?
Yeah, we've got some rules, as most groups do. I don't think everybody reads them, but for us, it's more about culture. So we are constantly encouraging the community on what an encouraging culture they are and how uplifting and positive, and they're always reinforcing the messages that we share on the podcast. So I think part of it is we expect a culture, and we also reflect a really good culture. We've probably only had a couple of times we've had to moderate a comment, but they're rogue people that have come in and not our ideal clients. But Kirsten, I don't think we've had any issues with that. We've got an incredible community, Anne-Marie. It's unbelievable.
Yeah. And you know what? I think that is really because you've taken the time to get clear on the business, the vision, what you stand for. And I think when you do that as leaders of the business, then, you're creating that culture that attracts the people who really resonate with that. And then they become those ambassadors that share, your message for you. So I thank you so much for sharing that. Let's just take it back a step back and then have a look at maybe some of the things that you look back on and you think, I wish we had done that sooner, or are there things that you would have done differently in hindsight?
Yeah, we would have joined forces way earlier. That's our number one thing. We would have joined forces as soon, I think, if we could go back in time, as soon as we saw the spike and the uptake in the podcast and how popular it had become, then I think we should have joined then.
Yeah. Is there anything else, or that would be the main thing?
There's a few things that we would have just started earlier, I think. Like, we would have started that Facebook group earlier. We would have created questions when people come into the group earlier. So now we capture people's email address and send them a free ebook and ask them about the podcast. So the things that we're doing now, in hindsight, often you're like, oh, I wish we'd done that 12 months ago.
Yes. Yeah. So that's interesting. So when someone requests access to join your group, you ask them, obviously, if you want a copy of our ebook, and the ebook
Correct.
has to be on, I'm assuming, on topic. So it has something to do with the art of decluttering. Send us or give us your email address, and then we'll pop that to you.
Yeah.
And then what's the question that you ask about the podcast? Have you heard about the podcast, or what's that question?
Yeah, do you listen to the podcast?
Yeah.
Yes. And if they say no, do you then make sure that you let them know what the podcast is and how to listen to it?
Not within the approval state, but we advertise the podcast several times a week, so it's
that's good.
Be hard to miss it.
Yeah,
and if they give us their email, part of the sequence that they receive is introducing them to the podcast, and here's our favorite episodes, and here's the most popular episode. So the sequence, if they've given us their email, includes that.
Yeah, fabulous. I love how you're integrating, lots of different touch points, because that's what it's all about. You hear so many people who launch podcasts, it's not working. Well, what are you doing with it? Well, I'm publishing it. Yes, that's just step one. You've got multiple steps after that, and they will change and adapt as the podcast continues to grow. Fabulous. So then take us back to the time where, obviously you launched it, and then all of a sudden you saw that there was something happening. It was bubbling along, and all of a sudden that obviously the listenership was growing and that kind of things. Can you look back and see what were some of the key things that were in place that enabled that growth to come? Have you kind of put your finger on what some of those specific aspects of the podcast was that generated that? Or is it still it's just, it is what it is?
A bit of both. It is a bit of like, it is what it is, and we have no real, there's no one thing that we go, oh yes, that made it really popular. We do think that decluttering has become a really big zeitgeist thing over the last couple of years. So we feel like we caught the perfect wave at the perfect time. And as I said, we were the first Australians doing a decluttering podcast. So, and Australians love hearing our own voices and love hearing, Antipodeans as a whole love hearing things from our own culture rather than hearing just American or UK things. So I think that's one.
I think we're in a very unique position, aren't we? Because people overseas love the Australian accent as well. And
we get a lot of feedback from our US listeners saying, I love listening to your accent.
And I'm from New Zealand, so every now and again, Fosh and Chops comes through. Say that one more time. But to us, it sounds like, she'll be right, mate, kind of thing. So it's quite unique in that way. I love that. And I think also to share a little bit about, so often people assume that when I have a podcast, I have to have this radio voice and I have to have this persona. And I've listened to a number of your episodes, and you are very much who you are.
Yeah.
And there's something about authenticity. And I'm just reading the latest, 2020 report of social media, and it's coming back to that authenticity, that conversations that people relate to. And you've always done that in your podcast, haven't you? Right from the word go.
Yeah, we've never tried to be radio voices. We are not that. I have a much stronger voice. Kirsty has a really beautiful voice that you want her to read you bedtime stories. Our voices, we could go and get voice coaching, but we've just done a listener survey actually. And one of the key things that people are reporting back is just keep being yourselves.
Yes.
And I think the fact that Kirsty and I have known each other for 20 years makes a big difference to that, because we're so comfortable. We often say we're like sisters, we're best friends, we're business besties. And that relationship, that's time, that's intimacy, that doesn't just come as business partners. So I think that our voice is very much out of friendship and out of truth telling and out of love. And we feel that for our listeners, so many times my beautiful business partner here will end up in tears on our podcast because we're getting feedback from listeners that just melts our hearts, and we love them. And I think the feeling has become mutual.
Yeah.
And I think it is, sorry, Anne-Marie, I think it does go back to what you were saying, though, that we are honest and vulnerable in the podcast. Like, there's often like not a moment in our podcast that I'm not crying. Like, over the show, I'm the crier, but we're different, and like Amy and I are both very different, so we bring a different flavor to the same topic, and we have the similar ideas, but we're different. But we're also warm and authentic, and people love that about us, and there is no airs and graces in our podcast. We are who we are, and we often get people commenting that it's like sitting down having a cup of tea with your girlfriends. So
so true. One of the other things that I'm finding too, through observing some of the feedback, is that those things that sound too polished, and I read this on the Edelman survey, that Edelman Trust Barometer, they said when CEOs speak, if it sounds too polished, then it almost is untrue. There's a disconnect there. And I think, with the podcast and what I'm hearing you share, there's a level of trust and respect and friendship that you're growing with your community. Now, one of the things that you said, Amy, was that you regularly check in. So obviously you do surveys, you check in with your audience. How regularly do you do that?
This is our first survey that we've done for the whole podcast community, but we kind of can take the temperature of our community through our Facebook group, and that gives us real-time feedback. Now, sometimes if it's right at the start of our recording period, we've got 8 weeks till we're back in the studio, but they give us feedback like, I really like the way you interview that person, or when you tackled this topic, I'd love you to go deeper in that. And so that real-time feedback is priceless in our community. And also when you look at Apple Podcast reviews and things, that's another way of people being able to come and we offer too, we're in clients' homes. So we're in the homes of our listeners, and they'll sometimes parrot back to us things that we've said, and that is another way of us getting feedback.
Yeah, that's so true. Now, one of the things that you have the ability to be able to do is that you are meeting with your clients face to face. And I know for many service-based businesses, they may not necessarily do that. But are you also integrating images and those things within, obviously, the Facebook group, and maybe even on your show notes too, to, just as a way to capture content and share that way?
We're trying to get better and better at that. It's been interesting merging our two businesses. When we were single businesses, we were very before and after focused, and because we were the art of decluttering, social media presence has always been more focused on the podcast. So now that we are the podcast and a service-based business and an online business, we do online courses as well. So we are still playing with the mix around that, and we also have to be very mindful that our Facebook group is a private or a closed group. And so decluttering can be a really personal topic. And so it's not like we could definitely do, hey, take a photo and show us where you're listening to our podcast. But we don't necessarily want people to take photos of their home and then show that publicly on social media without that. I mean, it's that tricky.
Wouldn't do that with clients unless, of course, you had written permission and
correct.
And so forth. But it's good to be able to look at all different mediums, because, as we know, touch points are so very important. And when you're integrating audio with visual, with actual engagement even further with the typing and the community that you're building, can be really strong, particularly when someone shares an after and they're celebrating and everyone's celebrating alongside them because they've just had a major win. And you would know what a client feels like and what someone feels like when they declutter. It really impacts all areas of their life. One thing that I'd love to check in on, particularly because if people are thinking of a co-hosted podcast, you hear of situations even in business where someone has joined forces with a good friend, and then sadly something happens and that friendship is terminated and it's impacted. what would you say? And you may not have necessarily had to do this, because sometimes, it comes together and it all works because you've got the same core values and so forth. But for someone who's just is thinking of starting, what would you share about things such as be mindful of the different strengths that you bring to the table, the clarity around who is in charge of what kind of advice would you have around that, so that whatever happens, that it doesn't turn into arguments and a termination of the podcast and ultimately friendship?
You go, Kes, just smiling like you've got something in mind.
Well, I just love, Anne-Marie, that you think we haven't ever had conflict, because we're in a relationship. We often say that it's like a second marriage. Having a business partnership, and even before we were official partnership business-wise, having a co-host in a podcast is having a second marriage or a first marriage if you're not married. So it does take relational work. We have had to learn, we joke sometimes that our relationship between the two of us is better than what we have with our husbands. we dialogue more than we do with our husbands sometimes. So we have found that to be absolutely integral to our business flourishing and our podcast flourishing and our personal development. Like, I cannot tell you how much I have grown over the last 2 years, and I know it's the same for Amy too.
Absolutely.
Just because of the dynamic of having a co-host and a co-business, like a business partner. We have had to do some deep work. We've had to be really analytical about our strengths and our weaknesses, and preferencing the other person and showing grace for the other person and standing in our own power and setting good boundaries. So it is so worthy of doing the deep work to have a great relationship, and it shines through in everything that we do, what we think it does.
And it's so important to us, because my friendship with Kirst is worth so much more to me than my business with Kirst. And so also I love her a lot, and I don't want her business to go under, and I don't want her marriage to suffer. I don't want her kids to suffer. I don't want her health. Like, I want to put Kirst, uplift and uphold her. And so in business, I think you really have to, like in marriage, like in parenting, consider the others better than yourselves and actually give that value. So we haven't nailed it, but we're in great relationships. Like we were saying just the other day, how good it is that we do that work, because, like, I have a trusted best friend that I get to do business with.
Yeah, it's awesome. And I think what I'm hearing come through is that if something does come up, does arise, that you address it, and you do so respectfully from the other person's point of view. Because often I think you can hear, especially with a podcast, you can hear the tension in the air. We can walk into a room and you can cut the air with a knife. You can do that auditorily too, if there's such a word, can't you? And
absolutely.
And that's so very important to consider too. Well, we're nearly at the end of our time together, and I just want to say how awesome I think you guys are. You're always just so very willing to, come on and share. And so now I'd love for you to share more about how people can find your podcast, what the URL is, and maybe too what the Facebook group is. So if someone thinks, 2020 is the year I've been saying I'm going to declutter my whatever, fill in the gap, that they can reach out to you, because you're doing some awesome work in this space. So please, the floor's yours. Share more about the podcast and how we can find the group.
So, sorry, Kes. Just search the Art of Decluttering pretty much anywhere. So in your podcast app, on Facebook, we're the Art of Decluttering community. But if you just put in the Art of Decluttering, you'll see our Facebook page, you'll see our community. Same with Instagram, same online for website. Just search artofdecluttering.com.au. So we would love you to connect with us. Come and be inspired for what 2020 could be, or get decluttered before Christmas. It's not too late. There's still, plenty of weeks left before Christmas for you to really take those steps, so that the summer holidays, if you're in the Southern Hemisphere, or if you're going into winter, is a time of freedom and not a time where you feel like you're slave to your possessions.
Yeah, so true. And I don't know who would like to answer this just quickly. I always love to give kind of foresight, because we've been talking about insight and hindsight. Foresight is really good too. whatever you want to share, what's in store? What exciting things do you have in store 2020 onwards? Have you got some plans in place, or what you'd like to see and do with what you've already got?
Well, we're casting really big dreams and vision at the moment. That's our job for the next couple of months, is to really seek what 2020 looks like. But we do know for sure that we are interviewing some really interesting guests over the next couple of months. Our show predominantly is just the two of us, but we do have guests from time to time. So we're super excited about some of the, we love all of our guests, but we are excited about what's coming next year. We are having a Christmas course coming up really soon, next couple of weeks. They're launching a course for around Christmas, and we love our signature course, which is called the Head, Heart and Home course. And the transformation that we have been able to see in people's lives through that course is just out of this world amazing. And that's what we are excited about for 2020.
Fantastic. And now, since you've dropped that hint, how can people find out more about that course? Can they go to that Facebook group, or is there a website that you can send them to find out more?
They can just go to artofdecluttering.com.au/Christmas, and it's all there.
All there. Fantastic. Well, thanks once again, ladies. It's been such a pleasure. It's always great to connect, and you guys are always up to doing something fantastic. And thank you so much for sharing it today.
Thanks for having us, Anne-Marie.